Let's bring it all together. Here in the studio is Mehmet Celik, a journalist, a political analyst, the editorial coordinator of the Turkish newspaper Daily Sabah. Thanks so much for coming into the studio, Mehmet. I know you have a bit of a winter cough. We'll get through it. Me too. First of all, we need to explain to the audience about the external threat that terror groups in Syria present to the region and the wider world. No doubt the EU is also concerned. You remember when there was that wave of migrants, they were thinking, who is coming in? Who could possibly threaten our security? Tell us about the PKK-YPG terror group's presence in Syria. Is it a historical presence that they use Syria as a base from which to launch attacks?
Well, Syria, following the revolution, has become a fertile ground for many terrorist groups. And the PKK-linked YPG is indeed one of them. Now, the presence of the Kurds, and I'm using the word the Kurds because many of the Western media uses this as if there is a presence of the Kurds, and all the Kurds are directly involved with the YPG, which is not the reality on the ground. Now, the YPG itself is an establishment in northeastern Syria, which is directly, organically linked to the PKK terrorist group, which has found itself established in northern Syria, northern Iraq, southeast of Turkey, for the past 40 years, and they have been in conflict directly with Turkey. Now, it is true that under the Assad regime, the Kurds, as a political, as an ethnic entity or an ethnic group, they suffered for many, many years. But the rebellion against Assad regime, which started after the 2011, their terror activities are not necessarily in line with the interests of the Kurds in general. Mm-hmm. As there's many Kurds who do not agree, who oppose actually with the YPG. And for a fact, I mean, one of the numbers here is very interesting. More than 10%, 10 to 20% of Kurds are present under the new Syrian administration's armed group, which was the HTS. So we shouldn't associate, first of all the Kurds with the YPG. And I'm making that very clear because the YPG carries out terror activities not only against Turkey, and it is not only a threat to Syria's territorial integrity, but their activities are also against the Kurds themselves. So which is something that needs to be underlined. They have received a large number of very heavy military support from the United States. Politically, they are supported by the EU as well as the United States. And they have become a very useful, for the lack of a better word, a very useful proxy mm-hmm. for the United States activity and presence in the region, rather than a very organic establishment that have survived, many decades. It's a very relatively new group compared to the PKK itself, which has been very present for the past 40 years. The YPG is a new entity, but their link with the PKK is very clear, and hence why Turkey sees them as a terrorist group, which is not actually in line with the US and EU position towards the YPG. But it is a little bit strange to see that the US and the EU sees PKK as a terrorist group, but another offshoot in Syria is not listed as a terrorist group, which is an interesting point.
Okay, from the political point of view and also maybe the cultural and social point of view, I actually had to write it down because there's so many ethnic and religious groups. So we have the Druze, the Kurds, the Assyrians, the Armenians, Christians, Alawites, and Shia Alawites who are Shia, and Arab Sunnis who make up the majority, the Sunni Arabs. The timeline that the interim administration, the question that Nizar, when we lost the line with him, what do you make of that timeline? 3 years to rewrite the constitution, 4 years for elections. That leaves a lot of space for people to start getting upset.
Well, actually, if we were to think the opposite of this, if they were rushing to an election, if they were rushing to a constitution process or drafting a constitution, many could also come with the criticism that this was done too quickly without including all the parties. Syria, and in fact the region itself, is not a Scandinavian region.
Yes.
Okay? Democratic culture is not, unfortunately, it's not very well established. And all the minorities that you just mentioned, including the Sunni majority, were under the oppression for past 5-6 decades under the Assad regime. So they will, in this new process, they will all seek to have a part in the new future for Syria.
They have to have
They have to have a. They will fight. Actually, they will raise their cards to have a inclusive Syria and for a better future. Now, it is true. Yes, time may seem as if it is long, but before the constitution, before the elections, I think there are some more other basic needs that the new Syrian administration must establish and serve to people before we can even speak about democratic institution, before we can speak about institutional reconstruction of Syria. But I think when it comes to specifically the constitution, as well as the elections, that time frame may seem long if we were talking about, let's say, some of the European countries. We were talking about an established democracy elsewhere around the world. But Syria is a different story, and that reconciliation will take time. Each party will have their own demands, and that's very natural, I think, in this process, that the time will be an environment, an atmosphere where they can agree and disagree, give and take, so that a more stable constitution and more stable Syria is achieved as an ultimate goal.
Okay, we have about 50 seconds left. How quickly does the international community need to recognize the new administration in Syria? Because as we already said, who under international law and the legal analysis is currently able to represent the Syrian state and its assets as well as its decision making?
Well, I think that must be established very quickly because, first of all, aside from all the, some of the constitution and elections and other things, there must be a quick reach to people for humanitarian reasons. And for that, so that they have a partner on the ground, legitimacy is one of the key actions that they must take.
Usually when we talk, you're at the end of a Skype line, so it's really great to see your physical presence here in the studio. Mehmet Celik, thank you so much for coming in.